Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sunday Shot. Thank you for joining us on what is a very chilly morning here in Sydney on the land of the mighty Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm joined as ever by my co-host, Dave Milner. Morning, Dave.
Morning, Joe. How are we?
Very good, thank you. We are waking up to yet more news coming out of the Middle East and America. This time that Trump, for all of his prevarication and vacillation, has ordered the B-52s to be moved into position for the bunker buster bombing, should that occur. To discuss this and more, we are joined by two friends of the Sunday Shot. Bruce Wolpe, Senior Fellow at the University of Sydney's United States Studies Centre. Morning, Bruce.
Great to be with you, Joe and Dave. Thank you so much.
And Dr. Emma Shortis from the Australia Institute, their Director of International and Security Affairs, and author of the first of the Institute's Vantage Point essay series, After America. Thanks for coming back onto the Sunday Shot, Emma.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So all eyes are obviously on the Middle East at the moment. Is it fair to say, Bruce, that this whole crisis can be traced back to Trump tearing up the agreement that Obama had negotiated with Iran and that had then been signed on to by the UN Security Council, the EU, Germany, to stop any military program associated with their nuclear program. That had been meticulously negotiated over 2 years by Obama. Trump came in and he really basically wanted to unravel any of Obama's legacy that he could get his hands on. So tore that up in 2018. Is that the source of this problem?
Yes, it is. And also, Russia and China were signatories or active participants in that agreement. It was a truly global, worldwide effort to
Mm.
contain Iran's nuclear program for obvious reasons. Um, Trump has form. He tore up the North America Free Trade Agreement and then declared, war on Canada and Mexico. Renegotiated an agreement. He becomes president for a second term, and he tears up that agreement because it's the worst agreement in trade history in the United States. So whatever was done by other presidents, and this it was President Biden, of course, who presided over the signing of this Iran deal, is suspect in Trump's mind. And yes, he campaigned on getting rid of it, and he did get rid of it. And so what that meant was, well, that Iran was free from the restraints of the JCPOA, and they have proceeded steadily to increase their nuclear capability. I think the best result from where we are right now, if there is to be a negotiated settlement, is some reconstitution of what Trump tore up. It, Iran insists on enrichment to some degree. I think the big question is, can that happen inside the country or outside the country? But that is exactly where the previous agreement was. So we are back at the starting gate of something that was making effective progress in containing Iran, and now it's Iran unleashed, and the United States unleashed, and Israel unleashed.
Yeah, I want to add to this conversation because the agreement signed between Obama and Iran allowed Iran to enrich its uranium to about 3.6%. They walked away at that stage. Weapons grade uranium is enriched to 90%. It's a very long way away from what we're talking about. Also, it's incredibly irresponsible to not mention the fact that Israel has an arsenal of illegal nuclear weapons in this scenario. If there's anyone in this geopolitical map that we should worry about their nuclear capability, and Israel's the only nation that has a first strike nuclear policy as well. So this idea that we're asked to believe that the safety of the free world depends on America bombing a bunch of people in the Middle East again, I find it unconvincing.
Oh, I think everybody finds it unconvincing, and I don't think anybody's, certainly not around this table, is suggesting that the security of the free world relies on this. I mean, I think Israel has been advancing this proposition, Emma, for now a very long time. some legitimacy that the Iranian government was determined to acquire nuclear weapons, and that was being curtailed by the agreement ripped up by Trump that Witkoff seems to have been starting, as Bruce says, to negotiate again from the beginning. And they argue that Iran having nuclear weapons, which I think everybody agrees is not a good idea, is an existential threat to them. So these are the two kind of premises, if you like, for what they're doing now.
That's right, and I think it's really worth highlighting that history, Joe, because there've been footage circulating recently of Netanyahu going before the US Congress in the 90s and arguing that Iran is a month away from developing nuclear weapons. This is an argument and an aim that he has had in particular for decades, and I think as much as Bruce is absolutely right that the tearing up of that Iran deal is the immediate consequence or the immediate sort of cause of all of this,
Catalyst,
that longer history is really important as well. And particularly when it comes to the United States, the loss of Iran in 1979 still plays a role in how many people on the Hill think about Iran.
Oh.
Iraq and Afghanistan were, in the minds of some, I'm thinking of Paul Wolfowitz, for example, in the Bush administration, stepping stones to Iran and to regime change in Iran. And so there has always been this drive for US intervention in Iran that, waxes and wanes in its influence and its power. But it is seeing an opportunity now, and it is seeing a president that is relatively easy to manipulate when it comes to this kind of military interventionism. And, Dave's, I think, right to kind of highlight the absurdity of this, because it also, I think, highlights the absurdity of Trump framing himself as the anti-war candidate, because he was never the anti-war candidate. And Dave's mention of nuclear weapons is critical there, because in the last couple of weeks, the Trump administration has requested $11 billion more for the agency that oversees nuclear weapons developments in the States. And so the dismantling or the crumbling of nuclear non-proliferation globally is also going to be a direct consequence of the Trump administration. And that, as Dave was pointing out, I think adds to the significant danger that we are in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we can get into the context in which Netanyahu started bombing Iran, the immediate context in relation to the military success they had taking out the leadership of Hezbollah, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, and those kinds of immediate things. But as you point out, Emma, the broader point is that they've always had an American president in place who has acted as a moderating force on Israel before. They have wanted to take military action, and they have been either persuaded against it or almost had it vetoed by the likes of Obama and Biden. Whereas now, with a weak president like Trump, who is just so far out of his depth on these issues, they no longer feel constrained by America. Would you say that's a fair comment, Bruce?
There's no doubt that Trump has campaigned fervently for Israel and Israel's security. I mean, if he's the first president, though, that's not for a two-state solution, and I think that is highly significant. But I also think the politics have changed in the course of Gaza, October 7 in Gaza, and there's some interesting numbers out. First, on Israel's favorability in the United States. There's always been strong support across the country for Israel. The Pew Institute Research Center did some polling within the past 2-3 weeks on where does Israel stand in many countries. So favorable or unfavorable. United States, unfavorable to Israel, 53, favorable 45. In Australia, the numbers were unfavorable 74, favorable 25. So the perceptions of Israel and sentiment towards Israel has changed over the past 2 years because of the events there, and so I think that creates a basis for tipping the scales against going the last mile to help Israel out at this time. There was polling in the Washington Post over the weekend. Do you support or oppose the bombing of Iran? and this is very interesting, support 25%. They interviewed 1,000 voters across the country. Support 25%, oppose 45%. So most Americans are not comfortable. And I think that is because most Americans are uncomfortable with so many aspects of the Trump presidency. I don't think they have a lot of confidence or faith in him. Among Republicans, do you support or bombing of Iran? 47 say yes, 24 say no. We'll get into this. This is the MAGA wing, the ultra MAGA wing of the party. Democrats, obviously 67% oppose where we are. So the politics are different from when we entered into a new world with October 7 and where constituencies are and where sentiment is, and then what the political consequences of acting or not acting can be played out.
We might go a bit earlier than usual to our interview because it's with Antony Loewenstein, who gives a good kind of overview of what's going on and the politics so that we can then kind of come back and get into that in more detail. So we'll first go to Antony. Why did Netanyahu, having really wanted to strike Iran for many years, choose now to do it?
I think he saw a unique confluence of events and opportunities to do so. As you say, Joe, he has been really gagging to bomb Iran for years. And if people haven't seen it, they can find online a lot of compilation to Netanyahu pretty much from the 90s, if not before, saying Iran is 5 minutes away from building the bomb. And he's been wrong every single time in this. There's been no evidence of that. And it's worth saying before I answer your question, just a few months ago, and it was confirmed this week, US intelligence services, who, yes, have a history of bullshitting. I'm not suggesting they're beyond reproach. Look at 2003 with Iraq. But they have come out and said clearly, we have no evidence that Iran is on the verge of a bomb. They could within 3 years. A lot of countries could. And this is not, as I often say to people, a defense of the Iranian regime. They're deeply repressive. I have many Iranian friends, as some viewers might too. And a lot of Iranians, both in Iran and outside, hate this regime with a passion. I spent time in Iran years ago. But that has nothing to do with an unprovoked Israeli attack on Iran. I think Netanyahu for years has requested American support for an attack. This goes back years. He requested it during Trump's first term. He apparently requested it during Obama's term. They said no. Fast forward to this year, Trump comes into office. There's basically no real opposition in Israel to this. When I say politically, there's barely any opposition. Late last year, there was obviously some tit for tat between Iran and Israel. Israel believed that they had knocked out Iran's air defenses. In other words, Israel has, as they have claimed, pretty much control of the skies. There are no ground troops in Iran, but there are Mossad agents who have been involved in this attack. Now, far as we understand, my guess is that's probably a combination of Israeli Jews and Iranians who have been essentially contracted to do the dirty work. We don't know all the details of that. It's top secret. We might find out in 5, 10, 15 years, if ever, right? This is how these things work. And I suspect this will start leaking out in months to come, but right now we don't know. And Israel initially claimed that we have an existential threat close by. We have to take out these nuclear sites and we'll be safer. And it's pretty clear that what they're trying to do is not so much take out the alleged nuclear sites, but potential regime change. And the idea, and this is what I've been saying day after day after day, the idea that a country of 90 million people, which is diverse, there are some in Iran who would love that regime to fall tomorrow, including Kurds, including dissidents. There are many who would not. There is no plan. There's no plan. This is based on reporting people I speak to. There's no plan for what happens if this regime falls. There's 90 million Iranians. So it's going to be controlled by who? And there was an editorial this week in the Jerusalem Post, a very hard right newspaper in Israel, saying our vision should be a Libya-style outcome. Now, what that means is essentially a failed state. Libya, we're talking about post-Gaddafi, which was another failed post 9/11 regime change war. a balkanization, essentially. So you have a weak, failed state with some Israeli backing, some American backing. I mean, Libya has become essentially a state where the EU particularly sends refugees to be tortured and often killed. I mean, it's an insane vision. So Netanyahu, I think, thought and hoped that by attacking Iran, Trump would then come into the picture and so-called finish the job. There are a number of deeply underground nuclear sites, which, according to our understanding, can only be destroyed by certain bombs that the Americans have. However, it's a pretty important however, there was a report in The Guardian yesterday which said, it was said in passing, but felt like it really should have been front page news. Some argue that the only way you can destroy these nuclear sites is with a tactical nuclear weapon, but Trump's not considering that right now. Right.
Wow.
So therefore, according to the reporting, and again, like everything, once you take it with a grain of salt, Trump is asking his experts, military figures, if I go in, will these be destroyed by these bunker buster bombs? And the answer is, we don't know. But even if it does, are we now as a global community saying that if we don't like a certain regime, if we think they're repressive, and there are many repressive regimes around the world, Iran is one of them, yes, we just can go in there and start bombing them. And it's quite clear that they're not just bombing so-called nuclear sites, they're bombing civilian areas. Now Iran is firing back and also undeniably targeting certain civilian areas. I mean, there's no doubt about that in Tel Aviv, Haifa, elsewhere. So we're kind of at this 2 minutes before midnight scenario where everyone is kind of hoping and praying, and I say this as an atheist, that Trump won't unleash American bombs, because that then unleashes this utterly unpredictable possibility of that regime falling. Israel has felt since October 7, when I say Israel, Netanyahu, many in the military, and frankly, many in the Israeli Jewish public, that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to vanquish our so-called enemies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, so-called enemies in Iran, Syria, etc., and also expand their borders. This so-called Greater Israel movement, which basically believes that the current borders are unacceptable, and in fact, the greater vision includes places like Lebanon and Iraq. Now, that might sound crazy to you and me, but this is the vision of some of these people. And at the moment, who is stopping them? The European Union is sort of putting out statements, which always works. They're very concerned. The US, we're sort of, hoping that Trump doesn't tweet something. I mean, this is literally what we're waiting for. What's Trump going to tweet? What's he going to say? I mean, it's an insane way to deal with policy. The Arab countries are frankly mostly on board, in my view. It's a really dangerous moment, is the short answer to your question.
Yeah. And look, it did move very quickly from we are going to be targeting only the military sites, taking out the top military leadership and the nuclear scientists, to moving into the broader leadership and cultural sites, attacking state media, all of those things as well, to basically an acknowledgement that there is regime change as an objective of this. I mean, that's being explicitly said now. There was some reporting that the timing of it, as well as with many of the enemies being in a weakened state, Hezbollah, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, that it was also to forestall the diplomatic negotiations that were going on between the US and Iran. If it looked as if they were going to be successful, then that would undermine, as you say, that historic opportunity.
Look, one of the things that's so unclear about these negotiations that, as you say, were going on with Iran and the US, were they actually serious in the first place? Now, we were given the impression that, yes, they were meeting Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, who's a real estate guy, so of course knows so much about Middle East diplomacy. Putting that issue aside, he was the point man from Trump. Okay, meeting the Iranians week in, week out to try to find some negotiation. Now, was that all bullshit? I honestly don't know now. And now, of course, you have this split, a supposed split in the so-called MAGA movement in the US, where you have your Tucker Carlsons and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who wouldn't exactly be the cuddliest folk you and I want to hang out with. who are on
No.
many, many issues are cretins and cranks, who are now some of the strongest voices against the war, which makes you wonder, where are the Democrats?
Yeah.
Where are those anti-war voices? Now, I'm not saying every Democrat agrees. AOC, for example, has come out, she's against it. But some of the top leadership, the frankly ancient and decrepit leadership, Chuck Schumer and others, probably agree with it. They do want a
Yeah.
regime change war. So this idea that the strongest so-called anti-war voices are coming from Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon.
It is. Yeah, we know we're in trouble when there is that. And it does seem that, I mean, Trump just actually doesn't know what to do. He's a weak and erratic leader, as we know.
Yes.
And this
And
whole
doesn't know
idea
much
of
about the situation. I mean, and also just does not know what the hell. I mean, he couldn't find Iran on a map. I don't mean
No.
that Trump is stupid, but he doesn't know much about much. Is this honestly what world stability is based on now? I mean, it's just a pretty scary state of affairs.
I guess the incredible thing about all of this is that, as you say, the real hawks are in America and in Israel are after regime change, but they are just failing yet again to learn the lessons of history and why there is this sort of being this disingenuous reporting that there is any kind of strategy at play rather than ideology.
But there's only no learning from history because there's no accountability for anything. I mean, why would these people learn? You know, why would they ultimately learn of anything went wrong when the same voices, Joe, who are pushing for the Iraq war in 2003 are the same people in 2025 saying, yep, we got to go bomb Iran. So people like this fail up. There's no accountability. And it's the same in Australia. So the US and Israel are the key players. Australia's obviously a sideshow here, but those similar voices are here too. If you read The Australian, which I often do for my sins, their voices basically are, well, you got to go into Iran, don't we? I mean, these are the same cretins and fools and thugs who supported every failed war in the last 25 years. But let's listen to them now. This time they might be right. And it worries me that the voices pushing back against that should be far, far stronger. Where are those stronger voices in Australia? I'm talking about here, The Guardian, ABC. I'm not saying they don't exist. They do, or the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, 9 papers. They're not strong enough. But it's interesting to say there's been polling done in the US just in the last week. The vast majority of Americans do not support this war, do not support America being involved, do not support that at all. And that's something. Now, will Trump care? Does Trump listen to that? He does like being flattered. So it might make a difference. I don't know. But just the idea that we are kind of, Trump now, the latest news is that now Trump has given Iran 2 weeks before he makes his decision. Okay, a decision about
Well, 2
what?
weeks seems to be the deadline that he always gives. He gave Putin 2 weeks, and then that deadline came and went with actually no even acknowledgement that a deadline had been missed. I mean, the other thing to note just in closing is that a lot of the Iranian peace and democracy activists, both within and without, are also very opposed to this war, as you started this conversation by saying.
Yes.
It's not about the regime itself, which is appalling, but it's about whether or not an external foreign war
Absolutely.
can be the engine of change.
Because there's barely any record of that working anywhere, putting aside the legality and morality of it. I mean, the interesting thing is the only real Iranian groups who are mostly based outside the country, putting aside groups like the Kurds who have been repressed for years and others who I suspect wouldn't mind the regime to fall, and they can, in their view, carve out some kind of, in their dream, independent entity somewhere within Iran, which, whether that's possible, put that issue aside for a minute. The groups within the West that are pushing for regime change who are Iranian are usually the most hardline, fanatical, pro-Israel zealots who have no support within Iran itself. The most prominent voice I can think of is related to the Shah, who was overthrown in 1979, which was a deeply repressive regime, backed, armed, and funded by Israel, by the way. I talk about that a lot in my book, The Palestine Laboratory. He's the one in the American media saying, yep, We need to go into Iran, overthrow them. And just remember the guy Ahmed Chalabi? He was a key Iraqi guy in 2002 and 3. People can Google him if they don't remember who he is, who was saying, if you go into Iraq, America, you're going to be welcomed with roses. Well, how did that work out?
Yeah.
Now, Iraq is not Iran. They're different countries. I understand that. But the idea that there is not just skepticism, but contempt for people who are pushing for an outside regime change, where America and Israel admit there is no plan. So you're just going to hope that you can overthrow a regime and just sort of hope for the best for 90 million people. It's absolutely insane. When you have the strongest, loudest voices in the mainstream Jewish community in Australia and elsewhere supporting, backing this kind of war. The front page of this week's Australian Jewish News, which is the only kind of national Jewish newspaper. It's a fanatical far-right pro-settler newspaper saying, we're thinking of our glorious boys and girls of the IDF and we wish them good luck in Iran. I'm paraphrasing the front page. Now, this is how non-Jews see the Jewish community. And this is what worries me. I gave testimony this week to the New South Wales anti-Semitism inquiry. This idea somehow that the mainstream Jewish voices are telling the community, we want more war and war and war. How would that not increase anti-Semitism? How can it not? It doesn't justify, but of course it does. Because non-Jews look at that and go, wow, the Jewish community is pretty warmongering. What's going on here? For what end? And none of this makes Israel safer, by the way, Joe. It's the opposite. Or Jews. Take a breath.
Okay, so I just want to pick up on a couple of the comments that Antony makes. First and foremost, I mean, he also alludes to the views of the American population, which are very negative when it comes to just gung-ho starting bombing Iran, but also the dearth of political leadership expressing an anti-war position and trying to put the brakes on potential military action by the US. So do you think, Bruce, that kind of tension between the views of the American population and the American political class, what impact do you think that will then have on the decision-making process that is happening in the upper echelons at the moment?
You see several senior Democratic senators coming out against bombing an attack on Iran. You have Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who went back to your argument, Joe. Well, this really started because of Trump ripping up the original Iran agreement. And you have Jack Reed of Rhode Island saying the same thing, and this should not happen. Where they're landing, I believe, is a process question, but it really does get to the heart of something, which is that Trump cannot act as president to launch a war against another country without a resolution of approval from the Congress. The Congress in the Constitution has the power to declare war. And so that debate is bubbling up, and I think there'll be a pressure for some votes on that. Now, they don't control the House or the Senate. I don't think the Republican leaders in the House and the Senate want to schedule any vote on that. But nevertheless, people will become more aware of that, and I think they'll seize it. In the Iraq War, I mean, Bush, to his credit, went to Congress saying, I want a resolution of war to prosecute and to sustain an invasion of Iraq. And Congress voted for it.
For credit,
including Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. They voted for it and everything. So you're right about the mistakes of history that many people made, but at least it was a democratic process. So I think we'll see more of that in the over the next week to 2 weeks.
So do you think that Trump will go to Congress, or do you think he will?
No, I don't think he will at all. I think he has complete contempt for Congress.
Yeah.
Doesn't this highlight across the Western world, there is a big division now between the opinion of the population and the actions of the establishment ruling class that are running these governments? I mean, you brought out these statistics about favorability ratings of Israel across the world. If you look across the global south, you know, the vast swathe of humanity terrified by Israel, supportive Free Palestine, none of our governments are acting on our behalf in this. This is why Greta Thunberg needs to jump in a sailboat and like go to Gaza by herself, you know, acting as the leader of our free world, basically. I hate that phrase. I keep repeating it.
Well, I'd like to hear from Emma on this, but I think there's a lot of pushback from European governments about against Israel and what it's doing in Gaza and what it's doing as far as attacking Iran. I don't see if there's any movement on this, it's away from Netanyahu and what he is prosecuting, and I think that's.
I hope so. I'm not convinced, because we've seen bipartisan support for genocide for 2 years. I'm not convinced this is just a Trump thing. I feel like, I mean, Antony, it's important that we talk about the project of Greater Israel, because through that framework, you can kind of understand why they're bombing Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Palestine. This only doesn't make sense if we don't allow that piece of the puzzle to land on the jigsaw table.
Yeah.
Well, Emma, a lot of those targets that Dave just alluded to, I mean, it is where they were also fighting their proxy wars with Iran, and they had great military success under the cover of October 7 and Gaza to make these different kind of incursions. And we do seem to have at the moment Israel being successful in its military campaign. It can't do the final piece of its puzzle and get into the mountain with the bunker bombs, because it doesn't possess that level of weaponry. But it is seeming to advance its military objectives in other ways at the moment.
I don't think it's very accurate to perceive the United States and Israel as separate power blocks. They routinely act in concert, a good cop, bad cop kind of situation. And you see this similar thing with the peace deal in Palestine, where the States gets into the negotiating room, acts in bad faith, scuttles the deal, while Israel's off bombing a hospital or something. It's a very similar process to what's happened in Iran.
And I think, if I can jump in, I think we also, you're right to highlight that, Dave, and we also underestimate what's happening within the MAGA coalition as well, because of course there is that ideological part of that coalition that is anti-war, genuinely anti-war in the libertarian sense, but that is a small part of the coalition. And a much bigger part of the coalition sees the United States and Israel as acting as one, exactly as Dave was pointing out. It's my little friend Viv here.
No, it's great to have little friends popping up in the corner.
And, JD Vance plays a critical role there. And I actually saw him speak in DC in May, and he made a speech about the foreign policy of the United States for the American middle class, and outlined how white Christians in the United States see themselves as totally allied with Israel because their savior was born and died in that place. And that religious fervor, I think, complicates the anti-war wing or the anti-war stance of people like JD Vance and even Tucker Carlson. And I think on balance, that power struggle will be won by that side because it is bigger. It's much bigger in the far right in the United States. And I think that context is really critical to understanding where this might go, and particularly when it comes to Israel and Iran, why those lessons of history that Antony outlined won't be learnt.
Well, it is kind of incredible with just how similar the arguments that are being put now in America, Israel, and through the right-wing press here are that there is this threat that we do need to act now, that the development of nuclear weapons by Iran is mere minutes away. And as Antony said, there's all that compilation of Netanyahu saying exactly this over the last decades, and still, there isn't a nuclear bomb as yet in Iran. Do you think, Emma, that the EU is having any impact in this? I mean, there is a bit of a schism between Berlin and Paris when it comes to Israel in particular. Are they having any impact on anything at all, or is the main game just Washington? And
I think it's a really good question, Joe. There's always been this desire for Europe to act as a moral leader when it comes to international law, given how progressive relatively it has been internally in things like the European Human Rights Act and the almost kind of federation of those systems of European law. And we talked about it in the first Trump administration, you know, this hope that Europe would become the moral leader as the United States vacated the field. I mean, I am skeptical given what we've just talked about in terms of the relationship between Israel and the United States, and you know, a Trump administration effectively unleashed, unconstrained by the rule of law in the United States. The ability of Europe to counter to that, I think, is severely constrained. But that's not to say it's not important in building alliances in support of the rule of international law outside of the United States. So with like-minded allies in Canada, for example, or South Africa. But the willingness, I think, to really come out strongly against the Trump administration on this issue in particular is not necessarily there yet. You know, and countries like France, countries like Australia can use strong language as much as they like, but if that's not backed up by significant policy, then it has no effect.
I mean, I want to get into this question of like these next 2 weeks, this sort of arbitrary deadline which Trump has just given himself. But before we do that, can we note that whilst there is now this complete focus on Iran and what is happening there, back in Gaza, the carnage continues. And if anything, it is getting worse, with people trying to get food and aid from this sort of odd hybrid private American-Israel sort of outlets where they're actually massacring people going there to get food. Whilst everyone is distracted, is there any chance at all that there'll be any kind of developments that the EU will be able to bring any influence to try and open up the borders and get aid coming into what is now a famine situation?
Who's the question directed to?
Anyone who wants to jump in, I guess.
I mean,
I don't see it. I just don't see any progress. It is catastrophic and terrible, but I just don't see any solution to it. And if we just put it back at the Trump level for a moment, you know, he comes in and he says, well, I want to solve Gaza, but he can't solve Gaza. I want to solve Ukraine. He can't solve Ukraine. I want to solve Iran. He hasn't done that yet. I want to solve trade wars. I want to solve China. He hasn't done that yet. But the common denominator to it is the hard work that needs to be done in diplomacy to get agreements concluded is really intense and goes for an extended period of time, but with a goal, and you keep moving towards it so you can create some momentum. He's incapable of that. He doesn't have the patience to do it. He's the CEO of the United States. He gives orders and he expects people to follow it. But it means that nothing gets solved. Can I put another issue on the table?
Please.
Around the corner is North Korea. They actually have nuclear weapons on missiles. They actually shoot the missiles around Asia. If it's illegitimate, I believe it's illegitimate for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. You can talk about Israel's weapons, you know, anytime you want. But here's North Korea, an authoritarian state that does horrible things to its people. And where is that going to go? Are we going to have an Iran-style confrontation with North Korea during this presidency? I don't know, but it's there.
He really seems to like the little rocket man. Like he doesn't seem to attract the opprobrium that these other players do in the Middle East.
Yeah. North Korea sends troops to Russia to fight Ukraine. Well, that is not a healthy development.
No. And I guess the thing is that weakened as Iran may be, they do still have the support of the Russians and the Chinese. They are still close to them. So the conflagration could get, you know, significantly worse before it gets better.
Could.
Can I just add that, yes, we don't want any crazy regime to have nukes.
Right.
America is quite clearly the craziest regime at the moment, and they're the only one that has dropped nukes on this planet. Like it is worth restating.
Yeah.
We memory hold this stuff over and over again, and we get terrified of the guys that look like the bad guys in Homeland and 24 and all this nonsense we've been mainlining for our entire lives. Like I don't think that's the threat to the world right now.
These are leadership issues. I've been reading a bit about Ronald Reagan, who I kind of miss these days. He was sort of okay, and his objectives with Gorbachev were to originally, when they met in Reykjavik, it was to eliminate nuclear weapons. They didn't get that far, but there was a real reduction in numbers of nuclear weapons. So these are we have an absence of leadership on this question, Dave, just as you say, and we're moving in the wrong direction. We're going backwards.
Absolutely.
And that is a prime source of instability in this world.
Well, if I can pick up on the point you made, Bruce, about it really is that Trump doesn't have the patience to negotiate peace. So it was always, I'm going to solve Gaza, I'm going to solve Russia and Ukraine in like one day. It's my first day. The world is going to be transformed. But his character doesn't seem to really allow for the investment of work, effort, care, patience. And that does open him up to manipulation by those who want the diplomacy to fail and whose objective is not the benign, peaceful outcomes that the rest of us want. I mean, Emma, he always talked about himself as a man of peace, but as you say in your recent essay, when you come in and you want to increase the size of the US military footprint, you want to negotiate with Russia, you threaten to take over Gaza, you confront China, you mention invading Greenland, Panama, and Canada. I mean, none of these things are particularly indicative of a man of peace more broadly. And when you're surrounded by powerful hawks who want to just bring out the Iraq playbook again, I mean, prospects aren't great.
That's right. Unfortunately, Joe, Trump was never anti-war, and I think that's really worth continuing to state that he's anti-particular types of war and anti-particular types of people dying in them. But generally, he loves violence. He relishes describing acts of violence. He relished using the so-called mother of all bombs on Afghanistan in his first administration. If he thinks he can win, he'll do it. And of course he thinks he can win. That's part of his argument, only I can fix it. And so, we're in this situation where a president who loves violence, who has access to an incredible nuclear arsenal, as Dave was pointing out, is the one making the decisions. And I think confronting that reality is really quite difficult because Trump is so good at kind of setting the agenda and or setting our understanding of how we frame him. He keeps talking about the Nobel Peace Prize. He's really upset that he hasn't won the Nobel Peace Prize
too, so that makes it doubly awful for him.
Exactly, that's exactly right. But this is the kind of person that we are dealing with, and I think confronting that reality is both necessary, but also really difficult for people, particularly in the Australian kind of national security establishment, who have very settled ideas of what the United States is and what it does. But understanding Trump as not anti-war and not isolationist, I think, is really critical to moving forward and understanding what he might do, in the intervening 2 weeks, because of the broader trends of American history. He has the space to do whatever he wants. He has the space to go in. He has the space to do it without Congress, without an authorization from Congress, because presidents before him since the Korean War have done that. And that is where, the mistakes the deliberate actions of previous administrations have created space for this extreme version of American history.
I still don't think it's a Trump problem. I think after the last 80 years of American foreign policy, we just understand that periodically they have to murder a few million people in Asia or the Middle East, otherwise their economy collapses. And I just think we should be so fucking cynical about what's happening right now.
Yeah, well, I think cynicism is certainly due. Bruce, we're going to move on in a minute and talk about Australia's the impact this is having on Australia and Australia's relationship with the US. But before we do, I mean, crystal ball time. You don't think he's going to take it to Congress. Do you think that will have any impact on his relationship with Congress? I mean, he's still got to get his ludicrously titled Big Beautiful Bill through the Senate. do you think there will be any blowback for him on other domestic political fronts if he acts in a unilateral way when there are some of the MAGA base who remain opposed to these forever wars?
I think that this moment crystallizes some real threats to his presidency on the foreign policy side, and Iran, and unable to solve Ukraine and Gaza and so forth. I think that if he's unsuccessful, if the attacks on Iran go in a truly horrible direction, and where there's no resolution, and things are not knocked out and whatever, then he looks like a failed foreign policy president. But if that coincides with an eruption in Congress against the domestic policy agenda, and he just can't get the Republican votes to pass it, then those are the two biggest things going on for him right now. So we've moved from a phase of he becomes president, consolidates power, is in command, executes all the executive orders and rearranges everything, and looks like a very strong leader. But if suddenly the strong leader can't deliver, and the result of all this is that the American economy is hurt, people are hurting more than they were earlier in the year when he took office, and they voted for him in part because they believe in it, had confidence in his running of the economy. If things get bad for middle America economically, plus failure overseas, that's trouble for him. So I see this as a pretty defining moment in the first year.
And Emma, if Trump does go in and authorizes the B-52s to drop the bunker bomb on the mountains, what then happens, do you think? Is it just impossible to try and assess what might be the consequences of either success or failure in taking out the nuclear program buried deep in those mountains?
Well, I mean, how do we define what success or failure is when, as Antony was saying earlier, there's no end game. There's no plan for victory. There's no vision for what Iran might look like after success.
I guess if the
whatever
success
that might
in
be.
taking out the program itself, but then kind of
sure.
what happens thereafter. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, Joe, the first thing I would say is, and we've been talking about this already, is that the momentum is always towards military intervention. In the intervening 2 weeks, if Trump is moving B-52s, that will continue. Everything will be in place. And the most difficult thing in American history is arresting that momentum, is winding that back. Yeah. And we've talked about Trump's unwillingness and probably inability to do that. And so, I think we will see, if the United States goes in, and I think that's increasingly likely, the United States be drawn in further, as when there's no clear plan, there's no objectives, I suppose, no clear objectives for victory, then inevitably you get drawn further in because the objectives change and they get bigger. And the push will be, if those nuclear facilities are destroyed, then, it's the push for the next one. And then it becomes the push for regime change. And if Trump perceives, as we were discussing, if Trump thinks he's winning, if he thinks it's making him look strong, if it's an assertion of power, if it's partly a distraction from what he's doing at home as well, then again, all the momentum heads in that direction. And when he's got people around him like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who also is in favor of this kind of intervention, he has railed against the Iraq war, but only because he argues that, woke military policies stopped the Americans from fighting the war as they should, and therefore stopped them from winning, which again is a pretty familiar argument in American history. All of that coalesces to further intervention and a further embeddedness of the United States in that conflict.
And if an attack on Iran leads to attacks on American bases in the region, or a closing of the Straits of Hormuz,
which you'd think would have to,
if it leads to a wider war, the American people do not want a wider war, and so there will be political consequences from that.
Yeah, and it's worth
but
also
I think
noting. Sorry, Emma, go.
I think also Bruce is absolutely right, but the risk of that creating further apathy in the American electorate is really significant because, Trump is elected partly on the basis that he's going to pull the United States out of the forever wars. He's the only one who promised that. Harris promised the strongest, most lethal military in the world. If even Trump doesn't do that, the potential for further disengagement from American democracy, I think, is really strong, as Americans inevitably and understandably come to the conclusion that nobody is interested in listening to them when it comes to their views on the United States' role in the world. And that's really dangerous for American democracy as well.
And that is when, as you say, Dave, we're relying on Greta Thunberg, which seems a lot to have on her slim shoulders.
It's an awful big weight for a 22-year-old. I think what we'll also see is, I mean, populations don't inherently want to go to war. They have to be primed for this. They have to have the consent manufactured. And this is why something that's very interesting and disturbing about what's happened to Israeli society is that we now have a situation where within that ecosystem that they've created, 82% of them are in favor of ethnically cleansing Gaza. 47% of them are in favor of murdering every woman and children left alive in the enclave. This is a state that does want war. It's Nazified to that degree. America isn't like that as a broad population, but it has incredible propaganda tools that are so good most of us don't even perceive them. And we will see that ramping up over the next couple of weeks, especially. But yeah, the degree to which the propaganda this time around is rerun, half-baked, chat GPT almost. It's just so transparent. It will be interesting how that butts up against the MAGA base and whether they're able to say, oh, this sounds like the sort of nonsense that Biden was spinning us last time. You know, it will be interesting.
And it is just worth noting, as Antony alluded to, whilst there is much dissent and much opposition to the Iranian regime, we saw the brave women in the Women Life Freedom movement a couple of years ago. None of these people are in favour of an outside engineered regime change, because that way history shows us success does not lie. The Australian media, amongst all of this, seem to be mostly obsessed about the fact that this growing catastrophe in the Middle East meant that Albanese didn't get his 10-minute meeting with Trump on the sidelines of the G7. And beyond that, there did not seem to be much analysis going on at all. And then I guess secondly to that, Emma, as all of this is happening, the Australian political leadership still seems to be blindly asserting that there's really nothing to see here when it comes to the transformation of American politics, and that our relationship with our good buddy America transcends one president to the next and all is completely fine.
Yep, that does seem to be the general drift of leadership. Yeah, Viv thought it was funny too. Of the Australian government. You know, I cannot stop thinking about how the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles was on afternoon briefing on the ABC a week or two ago and was asked about the relationship, and he talked about Australia's shared values with the United States, specifically identified those values as democracy and the rule of law.
Oh, really?
You know, to say that in the face of what's happening in California, what Trump is doing in California, to say that in the face of his assault on the principles of international law is extraordinary. And I think really goes to Dave's point as well earlier that, you know, that just does not reflect the genuine sentiment of the Australian community at large, which, you know, and we've done polling at the Australia Institute that reflects that 54% of people now want a more independent foreign policy. I think it's in Australia's interests to pursue a more independent foreign policy, which doesn't mean abandoning the United States or, you know, what are our shared values of democracy and the rule of law, which with much of the United States, with much of the American people. But it means recognizing what is happening. It means recognizing the new reality in which we operate, and that tying ourselves ever closer to an unleashed Trump administration doesn't make Australia safer. It puts us more at risk. You know, I think the Australian people understand that pretty well. The Australian newspaper maybe doesn't so much, you know, and is in quite a tears about all of this, about the AUKUS review and about that meeting, you know, the coverage of which was just so embarrassing. I mean, that it was the best possible outcome for that meeting to be cancelled, for Albanese to not have to sit through, you know, what would inevitably have been either a useless nothing meeting or, you know, a possible attack by the Trump administration that he would not have been either, I think, inclined or in a position to push back on. So not having a meeting is a good outcome. Keep not meeting with him. There's no point, because we can't rely on what he says anyway. It wouldn't have mattered what he said in that meeting, because he could turn around in the next 10 minutes and say something else. The United States is a totally unreliable ally under Trump, and the Australian people know that. When our leaders catch up is another question.
I think there's a long history in this company. What's the difference at this point? Australian establishment leaders thinking it's their role, it's their contribution to the national character and history to send a bunch of our kids to die for an imperial power, and to do it as enthusiastically as possible. I've seen this over and over again in Australian history. And people like Richard Marles and Anthony Albanese are walking my son's generations of kids primed cannon fodder for whatever war America wants to start with China. And we really need to take this stuff more seriously and just disentangle.
I think, Bruce, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is still, certainly Richard Marles, this overwhelming enthusiasm for the alliance to promote our relationship with America as this sort of special bond, and to keep basically advancing, from our perspective anyway, the tenets of AUKUS, even as the American side of that particular program is now undertaking a review. What do you sense is the American perspective on our relationship and on AUKUS? And are we just hiding to nothing with all of this at the moment?
At the congressional level and through the bureaucracy and through the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon, the relationship is essentially unchanged. They value Australia a lot. But really, because of what Emma was talking about and a change in values from the president as to what the United States stands for, we need what's happened. America is no longer the leader of the free world, and no country is following America in this in where he is going, except perhaps for Israel immediately. And secondly, the world trading system on which Australia's prosperity has been supported since the end of World War II, they're gone. So the world has changed profoundly, and I think we need a national conversation. If the world has changed, so how does that affect our relationship and what we want in a relationship with the United States? So we need to have that conversation. And then that gets to AUKUS, it gets to the position in Asia, and it gets to values. In other words, how close can you be with a country that's no longer a democracy, if in fact that's where it ends up? And what I'm unhappy about is that our leaders are not articulating that kind of outlook context for us. And I hope that they start doing that. As far as the meeting in that Albanese didn't have, it would have been senseless to have the meeting under that kind of pressure that Trump was under. I don't think it was a snub or anything like that. No. Actually, Starmer, I think, did heavy lifting on AUKUS from Australia's point of view, from the government's point of view, and on tariffs. He got some relief on tariffs. So when that conversation finally occurs, I think it'll be better than it would have happened this week.
And it is disappointing that our leadership is failing to grapple with these big issues, at least in public, when other countries are having those conversations with each other and their communities and their societies in Canada, in Europe. We are starting to really see people moving into the post-America world. But here in our neck of the woods, we've got loud voices from people like Keating, Carr, Evans, all of these sort of former leaders. Do you think finally, Emma, that they are happening behind the scenes and there will be a point at which it starts to break into the public discourse to a greater degree?
I mean, I hope so, Joe. I hope those conversations.
We have breaking news that in fact an attack has occurred.
Oh my God! So they've gone. The B-52s have moved.
Trump has said that there has been an attack on Iran.
Oh, okay. Wow.
America off to save the world again, huh?
Well, wow. Well, that's a way to end the conversation. There'll be much more discussion to be had on this. Will no doubt all be just eyes peeled to see what happens in the immediate term, and by that I mean the next hours, whether there is success in reaching the bunkers with the bunker busting bombs.
Let's not talk so clinically though. Like Tehran is a city of 9 million people, and it's being bombed by
I don't think that's the
horrific
bomb.
Regime.
What
What did the
that was
breakdown?
happening, but I think what we're talking about here is the mountains. Is it Bruce? Is that what you're seeing?
This is from the New York Times. The United States dropped bombs on 3 nuclear sites in Iran on Saturday. President Trump announced on Saturday night in the United States, bringing the U.S. military directly into Israel's war with Iran. Quote, all planes are now outside of Iran airspace, he said, adding that a, quote, full payload of bombs had been dropped on Fordo. All planes are safely on their way home. So we have to see what this leads to next.
Are okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and
we have to see what happens next.
Yeah, and how Iran responds, because, as you say, there's all sorts of U.S. military assets in the region. If they close the Strait of Hormuz, wow, okay. Lot going on for a Sunday morning. I want to thank Bruce and Emma for joining us today on the Sunday Shot for this conversation. Look, before we go, we normally have a kind of a tip and a moment for reflection or recommendation. With the immediacy of everything that's going on, that wouldn't necessarily seem frivolous, but is there anything specifically that you would like to draw our attention to, Bruce, for the coming hours and days?
No, this will overwhelm everything going into the week, and will change, harden and change politics in Washington and across the country, and certainly the world reaction. So we're in a awful new world.
We are in an awful new world. Any last thoughts from you about this awful new world?
I mean, maybe I can just give recommend that if you want to find out more about what's happening in the States and thinking in the States about that the Center for International Policy in DC does really incredible work, and Matt Duss in particular, the VP there, is worth following for analysis on the US in Iran.
Dave, last thoughts from you?
I mean, I'll have to compose my thoughts together. I don't like to jump the gun. But I did learn something this week that I thought was interesting. Apparently, Tehran is the only city in the world where some of its municipal budget gets devoted to the liberation of Gaza and Palestine.
Okay. Well, look, thank you all for joining us on what is a momentous Sunday morning here and in the Middle East and really globally. Thank you for watching the Sunday Shot. If you'd like us to continue to be able to have these sorts of discussions, please do subscribe to our channel and think about throwing a few dollars our way. It is, it's a bit challenging to do our little show every week, but we do think at the moment it is really important to be able to highlight the independent voices that are speaking truth to you and truth to power. So we look forward to seeing you again next Sunday, where we can look back on the week that was again. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.